Hello, everyone, and welcome to the first class of British Poetry and Prose 2. So in this course, we're basically moving into the second part of our overall study, and this is where things start to feel a little more familiar, a little more modern. Now, what that means is we're gradually stepping into the Renaissance and eventually into the early modern period. And honestly, this is one of the most exciting transitions in literary history because you can really see writers starting to think differently about art, society, and even human identity. So, to get us started, I just want to give you a brief introduction to how this course is going to work and what we are going to focus on together. Let's begin by talking a little bit about the course contents, just to give you a general sense of where we're heading and what you can expect in this course. Now, I want to draw your attention to the images on the right side of the screen. So you'll notice a red and white flower. This is the Tudor rose, which was the badge, or basically the royal symbol of the family that ruled England for many years. And then, if you look just below it, you'll see a round wooden building with a thatched roof. This is a drawing of the Globe Theatre, which was the famous place where audiences went to watch plays during this period, including many of Shakespeare's performances. Now, moving on, we can start looking at our course overview. With this course, we're slowly leaving the medieval world behind us. We're stepping into what we call the early modern era, which is a period when people really started to see the world in a completely new way. It was a time of major changes in science, in global travel, and also in religion. And in many ways, this is the moment when the modern world, as we understand it today, really starts to take shape. So in this course, we're going to focus mainly on the Renaissance, or in other words, the 16th and 17th centuries. That means we're looking at roughly the years between 1500 and 1699. We begin with the Tudor period, which includes the well-known reigns of King Henry VIII and Queen Elizabeth I. And then, as the course continues, we move toward the Restoration, which is the moment when the monarchy returned to power after a long period of political conflict and civil war. These 2 centuries were incredibly active and honestly often very dangerous for the people living through them. Now, if we step back a little, I want to draw your attention to the main theme we're going to follow throughout this semester. Basically, we're going to explore how changes in language also changed how people understood themselves. Writers began using language to describe what we call the self, meaning the idea that a person has private thoughts, personal emotions, and an individual identity. And at the same time, writers also started using literature to define the nation itself. They were trying to answer a really big question. What does it actually mean to be English? And this was a fairly new direction for literature. Earlier writers often focused on religious subjects or the heroic actions of kings and warriors. But during this period, writers slowly began turning inward. They started writing about personal emotions, daily experiences, relationships, the inner life of individuals. And that's exactly what we're going to explore together as we move through the texts in this course. So on this slide, you can see a tall wooden machine. This is a printing press, which was a relatively new invention at the time, and it allowed people to produce many copies of a book very quickly. Before this machine existed, every single book had to be written out by hand, which, I mean, you can probably imagine how slow and expensive that process must have been. Now, the first major change we can talk about here is the Reformation. This was a huge shift in religion when England gradually moved away from the authority of the Catholic Church. And what emerged from this was a new Protestant identity, which is basically a new way of understanding yourself through your personal religious beliefs. Because of this shift, people started thinking more about their individual relationship with God rather than simply accepting religious guidance from priests or church authorities. So religion, in a sense, became more personal, more inward looking. Now, alongside this, we can also think about the impact of the printing press itself. Since books became easier and faster to produce, they also became much cheaper. And as books became more available, literacy slowly began to spread. More people learned how to read, and that had a pretty profound social effect. Information was no longer controlled only by the church or the wealthy elite. Suddenly, ideas could circulate more widely through books, pamphlets, and poems, or at least they could reach far more people than before. So knowledge, you could say, started moving faster than it ever had. And finally, I want to shift your attention to another major development during this period, which is global expansion. This was the era of what Europeans called the New World, meaning the Americas. Sailors were crossing oceans and encountering lands they had never even imagined before. And this had a really huge impact on the English imagination. Writers began filling their works with themes of exploration, discovery, wonder, and sometimes greed as well. They were suddenly aware that the world was far larger and far more complex than they had previously believed. And that realization created a mixture of excitement and at times genuine anxiety. Now, I want to draw your attention to the portrait on the right side of the screen. So this is a very famous painting of Sir Thomas More, created by an artist named Hans Holbein. And if you just look at him for a moment, you can immediately see how powerful he looks. I mean, he has this very stern, very serious expression. He's wearing a heavy robe made of dark fabric and thick fur, which already signals wealth and status. And you can also notice this large gold chain around his neck, and that was actually a symbol of his high rank and his important position working for the king. And then, if you look closely, he's holding a small piece of paper in his hands, which kind of hints that he's not just a political figure, but also a man of letters, someone deeply involved in administration, writing, diplomacy, all of that. This kind of brings us to the first big idea on our slide, which is humanism. And humanism basically was a movement that started looking back at the classical world, ancient Greece, ancient Rome, those really old texts. The idea was that by studying these classical works, people could actually learn how to improve their own society. They believed the wisdom of the past could help shape a better present. And there's this strong belief within humanism that human beings, ordinary people, actually have the ability to shape their world and improve it. That was a pretty radical way of thinking for the time. Now, when we talk about Thomas More, we almost have to talk about his most famous book, Utopia. And the title itself is actually a clever little joke. In Greek, the word can mean both a good place and, well, no place, which already tells you something about how playful and critical the book is. The story follows a traveler named Raphael, who claims that he discovered this perfect island while sailing across the ocean. And on this island, everything is shared. There's no private property, no extreme poverty. everyone works together for the common good. But Moore isn't just describing a fantasy world for fun. He's using this perfect society to quietly, or maybe not so quietly, criticize his own country. He's basically holding up an imaginary mirror to show how greedy and unequal England had become. And finally, I want to shift your attention to something called the Tudor court, because during this period, literature was, honestly, it was a very high stakes political tool. Writing wasn't just entertainment. It could shape policy, it could influence the king, it could also destroy your career, or worse. The Tudor court was a place where one wrong sentence, one badly interpreted idea could lead to arrest or even execution. And Thomas More himself eventually lost his life because he refused to agree with the king on a religious issue. So when we look at literature from this period, we have to remember that writing wasn't just artistic expression. It could literally become a matter of life and death. Now, I want to draw your attention to the portrait on the right side of our screen. So you'll notice a man wearing a bright red hood and a green wreath of leaves around his head. This is Francesco Petrarch, who was a very famous Italian poet from the 1300s. And if you look closely, he's holding a small dark book in his hand, which represents his collection of love poems. What's really interesting here is that even though Petrarch was Italian, he kind of changed everything for later English writers, like far more than you might expect at first glance. This brings us to the idea of the Petrarchan influence. Basically, Petrarch wrote a very specific kind of poem called a sonnet, which is a poem that always has exactly 14 lines. Most of his poems focus on a woman named Laura, who, unfortunately for him, did not return his love. So a lot of his poetry explores this feeling of longing, that painful experience of wanting someone you simply cannot have. Now, we can look at how two English writers, in a way, carried this poetic style across Europe and adapted it into English literature. First, we have Sir Thomas Wyatt. And it's important to remember that Wyatt's life at the king's court was honestly pretty tense and full of political danger. He was frequently suspected of being too close to Anne Boleyn, who of course was the second wife of King Henry VIII. In his poem Whoso List to Hunt, Wyatt describes love as a hunt for a female deer. And as the poem develops, he realizes that this deer actually belongs to Caesar, which is his careful, slightly dangerous way of referring to the king. He basically warns other men that chasing her is pointless and also risky. Then, in another poem called They Flee From Me, he talks about how people who were once close to him, friends, lovers, allies, now avoid him. He compares them to wild animals that used to be tame but have suddenly become distant and unpredictable. So his poetry often carries this feeling of anxiety and instability, which honestly reflects the world he was living in. Next, we can turn to Henry Howard, the Earl of Surrey. Now, Surrey was a friend of Wyatt, but his poetic style feels much smoother and more polished. One of his biggest contributions is that he helped develop blank verse, which is poetry that follows a steady rhythmic pattern but doesn't rhyme. And that actually became extremely important later for English drama, especially Shakespeare. He also helped reshape the sonnet form so it would work
more naturally in English. In his poem, The Sooth Season, he describes the colors and sounds of spring, the freshness, the energy, the sense that the world is coming back to life. But there's a quiet sadness underneath all of it, because even though nature is renewing itself, he isn't feeling that same renewal inside. And in So Cruel Prison, Surrey writes about being imprisoned in Windsor Castle. He remembers the happy moments he shared there as a young man with his closest friend, and those memories actually make his current isolation feel even heavier, almost unbearable. And finally, if we step back and look at how their lives ended, there's something pretty striking. Both Wyatt and Surrey were powerful, well connected figures at court, but that didn't protect them. Surrey was eventually executed by the king, which really reminds us how dangerous court life could be during this period. So, in many ways, these two writers took an Italian poetic tradition and reshaped it into something distinctly English. And they basically showed later poets how deeply personal emotion could be expressed within very strict poetic rules, which becomes a huge foundation for English Renaissance poetry.
Now, I want to draw your attention to the visual on the right side of the screen, which shows a peaceful countryside scene. You can see rolling green hills under a soft, cloudy sky. There are many white, fluffy sheep grazing on the grass near a winding blue river. In the bottom corner, a shepherd stands alone with a long wooden staff. High up on a mountain in the distance, you can see the faint outline of a castle. This image represents the pastoral, which is a style of art and writing that focuses on the quiet, simple lives of people living in nature. This leads us to our first major writer for this section, Sir Philip Sidney. Sidney wrote a famous work called The Defense of Poesy. It is important to realize that during this time, some people were attacking poetry, criticizing it, dismissing it as useless or misleading. They claimed it was a waste of time or that it told lies. Sidney wrote this essay to defend his craft, to protect the value of literature and imaginative writing. He argued that poetry is the highest form of learning. He believed it was better than history, which only tells us what happened in the past, what already occurred, what has already taken place. He also believed it was better than philosophy, which is a way of thinking that is often too hard for most people to understand, too abstract, too theoretical for ordinary readers. For Sidney, poetry was special because it used beautiful stories to teach people how to be good and virtuous, morally strong, ethically responsible. Next, we can look at the idea of the pastoral in more detail. It is important to realize that writers used the simple shepherd as a mask, a disguise, a literary cover. They wrote about shepherds in the countryside to hide their true meanings, their deeper political or social messages. This allowed them to make complex political critiques, which is a way of pointing out problems with the government or the church without openly attacking authority, without directly challenging power. If the queen or a powerful leader got angry, the writer could simply claim they were just telling a silly story about a sheep farmer just sharing an innocent rural tale. Now, I want to draw your attention to Edmund Spenser. He wrote a famous collection of poems called The Shepherd's Calendar. We are going to study the October Eclogue from this book. An eclogue is a short poem that usually takes the form of a conversation, a dialogue, a poetic exchange between characters. In this specific poem,
two shepherds named Piers and Cuddy are talking to each other, Cuddy is very unhappy because he is struggling with his work as a poet. He feels that no one cares about his art, no one values his creative voice or his literary effort. It is important to realize that Cuddy is struggling with the need for patronage, which is a system where wealthy people give money to artists so they can afford to keep creating financial sponsorship, economic support for artistic production. Cuddy feels that without money and support, he cannot find his inspiration, he cannot sustain his creativity, he cannot continue producing poetry. This poem shows us the golden age was not always easy for writers. Even though this was a time of great art, poets like Spenser still worried about how to pay their bills and how to keep their creative spirit alive, how to survive materially while preserving their artistic passion. So let's talk about William Shakespeare now. So Shakespeare lived during the late 1500s and early 1600s. It was a time when theater was becoming one of the most popular forms of entertainment. I mean, people from very different parts of society were going to watch plays. He wasn't just writing for rich or educated people. He was writing for large public audiences, which included workers, merchants, nobles, and even members of the royal court. So his audience was really very mixed, very socially diverse. He wrote tragedies, which are plays where characters often face suffering and death, and comedies, which are plays that usually focus on love, confusion, and happy endings. He also wrote history plays, which tell stories about English kings and national struggles, stories about power, conflict, and national identity. Shakespeare was very interested in human emotions, which means he focused on love, jealousy, ambition, friendship, and betrayal in ways that felt very real, very recognizable to audiences. He wasn't just writing about heroes or kings, he was writing about feelings that, I mean, people still experience today. Many of his plays were staged at the Globe Theatre, which was a large open-air theater where hundreds of people gathered to watch performances, sometimes standing for hours, sometimes reacting very loudly to what they were seeing. And that kind of lively audience atmosphere had a huge influence on how Shakespeare shaped his plays. Next, we can look at the first point on our slide, which is subverting tradition. In the past, poets wrote about a perfect idealized woman, which is an idea of a person who is flawless and almost like a goddess. Shakespeare decided to move away from this. He chose to write about a dark lady instead. He describes her as a real human being with flaws, which was a very big change from the poets who came before him. This leads us to how he used his sonnets to explore realism and irony. It is important to realize that Shakespeare did not just write about pretty love, he wrote about the messy parts of being in a relationship. He uses irony to describe love and aging, which is a way of saying one thing while meaning another. He talks about how lovers lie to each other to stay happy. He shows us that even when we know the truth about someone's age or their faults, we still choose to love them. Now, I want to draw your attention to his technical mastery. Shakespeare was a master of the couplet, which is the name for the final two lines of a sonnet. These two lines always rhyme with each other. It is important to realize that he used the couplet as a tool for dramatic resolution. This means the last two lines often act like a sudden twist or a final thought that changes the meaning of everything you just read. He used this small space to solve a problem or to make a very sharp point about the human heart. Next, we can look at a group of writers, often called the metaphysical poets. This leads us to John Donne.
who was really the leader of this new and honestly rather unusual poetic style. It is important to realize that Donne did not want to write smooth or easy poems. He wasn't interested in simple beauty. Instead, he used what we call conceits, which are very long and unusual comparisons. A conceit is a metaphor that connects two things that at first glance seem completely unrelated, things that don't seem to belong together at all, and this forces the reader to think very carefully, very actively, to understand how the comparison actually works. Now, I want to draw your attention to one of his most famous poems, which is titled The Flea. In this poem, Donne combines the erotic with the intellectual, physical desire with logical argument. He tells a story about a man trying to convince a woman to sleep with him. And his argument is honestly quite strange and surprisingly clever. He uses a flea that has bitten both of them as his main example. He says that because their blood is already mixed inside this tiny insect, they are in a way already connected, already united. He argues that being together physically would not be a sin because the flea has already done the work for them. So the poem becomes this very playful but also very complicated logical puzzle about desire, persuasion, and intimacy. This leads us to some of his other well-known poems, including The Apparition and A Valediction, Forbidding Mourning. In The Apparition, Donne describes a man who dies of a broken heart and promises to return as a ghost to haunt the woman who rejected him, which creates a very dark, very emotionally intense atmosphere. In A Valediction, he presents a very different idea of love. He talks about a love that is so strong it does not require physical closeness, a love that can survive distance. He compares the lovers' souls to a mathematical compass, which is a tool used to draw circles. He explains that even when one part of the compass moves away, the other part stays fixed, and in the end, they remain connected at the center. It's a very surprising, a very unexpected way to describe emotional loyalty. Finally, it is important to realize how Donne connects what we call the sacred and the profane. The sacred refers to holy or religious experience, while the profane refers to ordinary physical life, things like romance, desire, or attraction. Donne often uses the same intense, passionate language when he writes about his love for God as when he writes about romantic love. He believed that the spirit and the body were deeply connected, not separate, not in conflict. And that was actually a very bold, sometimes shocking way to write during the 17th century. Now, I want to draw your attention to the beautiful image on the right side of the screen. You are looking at a photo of Penshurst Place, which is a very old and famous estate in the English countryside. You can see the large stone walls of the house, which look strong and permanent, almost castle-like, almost built to last forever. In the front, there are perfectly trimmed green gardens and a round pool of water with a statue in the center. The sky is bright blue and everything looks very calm and organized, very balanced, very carefully arranged. This picture very clearly captures the spirit of the poet Ben Jonson. This leads us to the idea of neoclassicism. It is important to realize that while John Donne was writing very wild, very intellectually complicated poems, Ben Jonson wanted to do the opposite. He wanted to return to clarity and order, to structure, to control. He followed the rules of the ancient writers from Rome, classical Roman authors, writers who believed in balance and discipline. He believed in restraint which is the idea that you should control your emotions and write in a clean, polished way, not too emotional, not too chaotic. He gathered a group of young poets around him who wanted to write just like him, and they called themselves the tribe of Ben, a circle of followers, a kind of literary group built around his style. Next, we can look at his famous poem, To Penshurst. This text is a country house poem, which is a special type of writing that praises a wealthy person's home, a poem that celebrates an estate and the family who lives there. But Jonson does something interesting, something slightly unexpected. He does not praise the house for having gold or marble, not for luxury, not for decoration. Instead, he praises it for being generous, for its hospitality, for its kindness to visitors. He says, the lord and lady of the house always feed their guests and take care of the neighbors. They support the local community. They share their wealth. He argues that a true home is defined by the people inside it, not by how expensive the furniture is, not by material wealth, not by outward display. He presents this house as a model for a perfect English society, a social ideal, a vision of moral and social harmony. Finally, I want to draw your attention to a much sadder poem titled On My First Son. This is an elegy, which is a poem written to mourn someone who has died, a poem that expresses grief, loss, and remembrance. Jonson wrote this after his 7-year-old son passed away, after losing his child, after experiencing very personal tragedy. Unlike the complex puzzles we saw with Donne, this poem is heartbreakingly simple, very direct, very emotionally clear. He calls his son his best piece of poetry, his greatest creation, his most precious work. He wonders if it is a mistake to love anyone too much because they can be taken away so easily, taken suddenly, taken without warning. It is a moment of pure, plain-spoken grief that anyone can understand, grief that feels honest, grief that feels painfully human. Now, take a moment to look at this dramatic image on the right. This is a famous illustration by Gustave Doré, which depicts a scene from Paradise Lost. You can see here a swarm of angels tumbling down from the sky. They look chaotic and desperate as they fall into the darkness below. Leading them is a figure who looks powerful but defeated. So this captures the exact moment when the rebel angels are cast out of heaven. We can say that it is a terrifying and beautiful image that sets the stage for the final part of our course. From here, we arrive at the King James Bible. It is important to realize that this was not just a religious book. I mean, it was a masterpiece of literature. Before this version, there were many different translations floating around. King James ordered a team of scholars to create one standard version for everyone. They created a style of writing that was simple, rhythmic, and incredibly powerful. The way we speak English today is still heavily influenced by the phrases they chose more than 400 years ago. At this point, we encounter John Milton and his massive poem, very long poem, Paradise Lost. Milton had a very ambitious goal. He wanted to justify the ways of God to men, which means he wanted to explain why God allows evil to exist in the world. He retells the story of Adam and Eve, but he focuses heavily on Satan. He makes the devil a complicated character who is proud and angry rather than just a simple enemy. So to finish, we can say that at the beginning of the class, we will study shorter poems like sonnets, I mean poems about personal love and relationships. And at the end, we will finish with an epic poem that deals with the story of all human beings and their fall from paradise.
The movement is very clear and easy to see. We travel from one person's feelings to a large story about good and evil affecting the whole world. It gives the course a strong and clear ending to our study of the early modern period.
Now, I want to draw your attention to our final slide. You'll probably recognize the face of Venus from the birth of Venus. She's rising from the sea, and that image works really well as a symbol of rebirth, because that is exactly what the word Renaissance means. It means rebirth. This whole period was about waking up after a long sleep, in a way. People started looking back at the ancient world again. Greek and Roman ideas came back into focus, and they used those ideas to imagine a new future. This leads us to the rise of humanism. What we see in this period is a big shift in how people understood their place in the universe. During the medieval period, life mostly focused on God and the afterlife. But during the Renaissance, attention slowly moved toward human ability and human thought. Writers like Thomas More and Sir Philip Sidney showed that people could shape their society. They believed education could help people grow, it could help them think better and live better. Next, we can look at what we call the linguistic revolution. When we first start this course and look at the early Tudor period, you will see that English was often seen as a rough or simple language. It wasn't always respected, but over the next 2 centuries, but that changed a lot. We'll see Shakespeare stretch English and play with its rules, and will the King James Bible give English a strong rhythm and clarity. By the time we reach Milton, English becomes powerful enough to carry epic stories. It also becomes strong enough to talk about religion, morality, and big philosophical questions. We can also talk about the idea of the modern eye. This might be the most important idea we'll take from this course. Across the semester, we'll see writers explore the idea of the self. Shakespeare writes about aging and self-reflection. He looks at himself very honestly. Donne writes about his inner conflicts, especially between spiritual love and physical desire. These writers teach readers how to describe private emotions. They show how people struggle inside their own minds, and they help shape the idea of the individual person, which still influences how many of us understand identity today. Finally, it's important to remember that this period was also a world full of tension. The Renaissance wasn't only about beauty and creativity, it was also a time of serious conflict. Religious disagreements caused violence. Political struggles caused civil war. At one point, a king was even executed. And this reminds us of something important. The great art and literature we studied were created during moments of fear and uncertainty. In many ways, the beauty of the Renaissance grew out of the chaos around it. So this is basically what this course will be about. We'll take where we left off from last semester, that is the Middle Ages, and continue with the Renaissance. I hope you'll enjoy it.